The morning light fell through the tall glass of the Tech Vision atrium in a long, thin rectangle, warming the worn edge of a broom handle and catching the dust motes that drifted like slow snow. Jack Hale pushed his cart along the tile with a practiced rhythm, the squeak of one wheel, the soft slap of a dustpan being set down, the muted clink of a coffee cup against the metal shelf. He kept a small pencil tucked behind his ear, its tip chewed and broken in many places. He had long since learned to make do with what was left of it. He'd been a math professor once, a man who could make chaos look like order on a chalkboard. Numbers had been his way back then, proofs and patterns that felt like hands holding him steady. Now he wiped fingerprints off glass and emptied recycling bins, and at the end of the day he pushed a small stroller up a short flight of stairs and buckled a small, quiet boy into the car seat. The world reduced certain things to titles: professor, janitor, CEO. Those titles fit people into boxes. Jack knew the boxes, but had stopped letting them define the work his hands could still do. Ethan sat in the tutoring room with a pencil in his fist, the small paper edges beneath his fingers neat and deliberate. He drew the same house over and over, a tiny rectangle with a triangle roof, a square window with a cross, sometimes a stick figure by the door. He was 7. He had stopped speaking the afternoon of the funeral and had not started again. Not in sentences, not in fragments, just quiet. Jack's voice in the afternoons was soft, the sort of timbre that did no harm, even when it corrected a crooked fraction or explained why a number behaved the way it did. He used whatever he could find to teach. Half a paper plate became a pizza to explain fractions. A mismatched set of crayons became a lesson in patterns. Children who came through the after-school program were rowdy at times, then calm. They argued, laughed, and learned. Ethan sat at the edge, always with a pencil, always with the house. Miss Rowan ran the program. She had a way of managing 30 small needs without raising her voice, an art that came from years in classrooms. She liked books that smelled faintly of glue and had pockets of patience she could dole out like small coins. She would sometimes watch Jack when he stayed to tidy after the kids left, and there was a stillness in him that reminded her of the quiet before a storm, a careful attention that made things better, one gesture at a time. Clara Lane moved through the building like an orbit everyone else adjusted to. The CEO wore a blazer that never wrinkled and shoes that walked a straight line. Her office on the 12th floor had glass walls with a view of the river and a coffee mug with a slogan about leadership painted in tasteful gray. She believed in systems and policies, in safety procedures and checklists that kept things running. She also believed, stubbornly, and sometimes to the detriment of those around her, that good intentions were not enough without structure to back them up. It was a Tuesday when the whisper happened, an ordinary day that would come to mean something larger. The kids were building paper boats for an experiment, tracing lines down corrugated cardboard and folding until the creases held. Ethan sat apart from the group, the quiet center of the room. A boy across from him asked a question that would have had any other child answering without pause. Ethan did not look up. Jack crouched beside him, the worn pencil in his hand. For a while he merely watched, letting the child's silence sit beside them both like a second occupation. When he finally spoke, it was in a tone that could have been a fact or a comfort. It was hard to tell until it landed. "Try saying it like this," Jack breathed, soft as the moth wings of a page being turned. He pressed his lips close to the child's ear, not close enough to be secretive, only close enough that the sound could be shared clearly and gently. "Say it with me. I am safe." Ethan's fingers tightened around the pencil. The words didn't rush into speech. He shifted his weight, a little tremble in his shoulder. Jack didn't push. He repeated the line once, a little lower, matching the boy's pace. The phrase fell into the small space between them and stayed there like a warm stone. It was not a command, it was not a promise. It was an offering of a thought the boy could practice when the world got too loud. Miss Rowan watched from across the room. She saw then what she had already begun to suspect. Jack wasn't merely a man who cleaned floors. He listened. He had the knack of folding knowledge into whatever children could hold. She filed the scene away like any other good piece of evidence, a harmless, tender intervention by a father who wanted his son to find his voice again. But evidence is only valuable to the mind that will look at it fairly. In the hallway during pickup, Clara happened past and saw Jack and Ethan. She saw a man leaning over a child, speaking into his ear. Her mind moved like the policy manual she kept in her head. Procedures, safeguards, liabilities. Here was a man without a title the company recognized as authorized to instruct children. She imagined headlines and memos, the possibilities bred by being cautious in a world that rewarded caution. Her face closed slightly. Later that week, the after-school room buzzed with small victories in the scrape of chair legs. A volunteer had brought extra pizza slices to make fractions live. A few parents came for a quick chat. Clara stopped in for a tour, an impromptu rite where she could check the program she loved to see running in perfect, efficient motion. As she walked past, she stepped into the doorway and watched its current life with an outsider's eye. Jack had been straightening a shelf when she entered. He lingered outside the after-school door, hands on the frame, and watched the children through the glass as if the panes could let voice move through them. He scribbled notes and left small folded paper houses on Ethan's desk, no more than reminders that someone saw them both. In the middle of that week, Miss Rowan invited Jack to stay for a short meeting in her tiny office. It was a room cluttered with library books and the kind of stickers that 10-year-olds prize. She had an expression that mixed apology and something like defiance. "I don't think anyone saw what you saw," she said quietly, sliding a paper cup across the desk and motioning him to take it. "But I did, and I know the difference between meddling and helping. You spoke to him like a parent. He needs that." Jack set the cup down without drinking. "I don't want trouble," he said. "I only want to help him and any kid that needs a hand." "You were a professor once, right?" Miss Rowan asked before she could stop herself. It was the kind of question that hung in the air like the smell of coffee grounds, steeped in both curiosity and recognition. Jack gave a small nod. Mathematics, 10 years at a state college. Family, things happened. He chose words that were precise but did not overstay their welcome. His grief was an edge in his sentences. It made them sound smaller when he spoke them aloud. "Your presence is helping," Miss Rowan insisted. "But I'll be honest, we need to keep things above board. If Clara is worried, she's trying to protect the program. Policies matter." Still, she tapped the file drawer and sighed. "Look, if you want, bring whatever credentials you have and I'll back you. I'll put your name down as an approved volunteer. The kids need teachers, not titles." There was a pause where the room collected itself. In that pause, Jack looked at the small paper houses he had folded, at the way Ethan's pencil left little tomato sauce smudges where he had used the leftover paper to trace circles like pizzas. He had come to Tech Vision because he needed something stable to hold the mornings together after the funeral swallowed the rhythm of their lives. He had found, in small pockets of time, a place where his hands could still be useful. He had not expected the built-in bureaucracies of a tech campus to mistake hands for harm. "I'll get the paperwork," he said finally. It was a small, practical answer, and it pleased Miss Rowan enough to smile. The world, she believed, could be nudged toward mercy by little acts of administration. If you believe in second chances, tap like. Miss Rowan wanted to say it then, a gentle plea that the audience could show small support in a world that measured worth in clicks and hearts. The urge to ask for backing felt like a betrayal of the quiet they'd shared. Jack's work wasn't about likes. Still, the suggestion hung in the moment like a wanted light. It was said instead in the soft, human way she told a parent they were doing fine. The formality of paperwork did not fully remove the weight of the earlier scene. Clara watched the process with an internal ledger. She had read the file. She rationalized the moment before she let herself feel it. The company's policies were there for a reason, and she was a steward of the structure that kept people safe. Later, in private, she would look at a photo in her office, one of her as a child, hands messy with paint, and she would remember how it felt to be seen as less than. For now, she felt the definition of her job tighten like a collar. Jack filed his credentials as they asked. He kept coming to clean. He kept making paper pizzas for students who never knew a fraction could be so delicious. And Ethan kept drawing houses. The day of the standardized assessment arrived like any other day that requires courage, the kind of small terror that lives in children's chests when they know their voice will be tested. The atrium had been rearranged for the event. Chairs in neat rows, a podium at the front, and a banner that read in large corporate letters, Community Learning Showcase. Parents came with thermoses and clinging smiles. The air smelled of printer ink and nervous coffee. Children walked to the front one at a time to demonstrate a learned skill. Some solved equations on a tablet, others read from their notebooks. Jack sat with his mop and cart tucked against a pillar, pretending to sweep, eyes soft as they followed the kids' small triumphs. Ethan avoided the center of attention. He sat near the middle, small fingers tracing the edge of his paper house. When the teacher called his name, the room leaned forward collectively. Miss Rowan had promised everyone that there would be room for every child to succeed in whatever way they could. Some would speak, some would perform, some would simply be recognized. When Ethan walked to the front with his small paper house held like a shield, the air seemed to thin. He came to the microphone and held it like someone it had never met. The glare of the auditorium lights made his eyes small. For a moment he just stood there, paper house pressed to his chest like a garment. The line of parents behind leaned in. Clara, in the front row with a small messenger from HR, watched with the same disciplined curiosity that had driven her to design systems in the first place. She felt a tightness settle in her jaw. Miss Rowan stayed 2 steps behind Ethan, close enough that the boy would feel secure if he needed it. Her presence was the scaffolding to his moment. Everyone waited for a sound that might never come. Ethan opened his mouth and then closed it. He tilted his head like a question. The hush in the room had weight. It was the kind of silence that could make a man believe the ground was holding its breath. And then Miss Rowan stepped forward and did something no one expected. She looked at Ethan with that careful teacher gaze. No spotlight, no pressure, and then she turned to the audience, her voice clear but gentle. "You know," she said, "there's something I think you should hear." When he first stopped talking, his dad would kneel beside him and say a small thing, just a phrase. It wasn't magic, it didn't fix everything, but it let him try again. She paused, and the room tilted toward her like all good listeners. He whispered, "Say it with me. I am safe." The words spread through the auditorium like sun through mist. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The phrase was simple and, in its way, merciful. It did not promise a cure. It offered a practice. It named an anchor. Ethan's fingers tightened on the paper house. A small exhale left him. It was almost a sound and then a sound. He said a single syllable, low, like someone drawing a breath out after holding it too long. Safe. The room cracked open with a sound that was not applause at first. It was a convulsion of relief. Someone made a small noise that sounded like weeping. The speech didn't pour out of Ethan all at once. He said the word again, louder, and then, looking directly at his father, who stood at the back by the pillar, he added the rest as if piecing a sentence together from bricks he'd held in his pocket. I am safe. Jack felt it first as a physical thing, his chest unclenching, the pencil behind his ear suddenly very sharp, the world setting itself back to a rightness he had not dared to imagine. He had not expected the stage, the mic, the audience. He had only expected the small practice, the repetition, the patient scaffolding. But hearing the phrase in that room, from his son's mouth, braided their histories into one another again. Clara's face changed in a way that took her by surprise. The lines around her mouth softened. She had been the one to call procedure into action, the one who had pushed policy above the human. Now she saw full people where she had fit parts, a father and a son, a past and a present. Her hands curled in her lap as if to hold something fragile and newly warm. After Ethan spoke the full phrase once, Miss Rowan guided him gently to the podium and asked if he'd like to say what the house meant. He looked at the paper, then at his father, and then back at the small crowd. It's home, he said, soft and round. It's where He stopped. Words came in pieces, but they came. Parents moved nearer like tides pulling at the shore. When the applause broke, it was not empty. It was a sound that carried small understanding. Clara stood at her seat, the applause washing over her with a letdown that felt like an apology she hadn't yet given. The revelation of the whisper had validated Jack in the most public way that could follow humiliation. But validation sits precariously beside another thing, curiosity. After the ceremony, as people milled in the atrium and children clutched certificates, Miss Rowan pulled Clara aside and, with a gentle insistence, suggested Clara take a moment to talk to the man she had asked to step back. Clara found Jack by the pillar, the mop handle upright like a semaphore. He was counting the days in his own head, or perhaps counting the number of sharpened pencils he had left. When she approached, he turned, ready perhaps for another formal request, or an apology he would have to brace himself for. Instead, she said, plainly, I'm sorry. It was a short sentence, not rehearsed and heavy, but it was the sentence that stood between correction and confession. Jack let it land. Why? He asked, with the careful curiosity of someone not eager to make an enemy of truth. You looked like a risk to me, Clara said. I saw a man I couldn't account for in our protocols. I was thinking in terms of liability and safety, and not in terms of a father helping his child. That was my mistake. Jack's reflex was not to push it away. He had been punched and then asked to smile. He'd had enough of that. I understand why you did what you thought you had to do, he said, but I need to be here for him, Miss Lane. He needs someone who will keep saying the small words over and over. Clara's shoulders dropped a fraction, the way they do when a person allows space for new information. Show me who you are, she said. There was an invitation in that, awkward and corporate slick, but real. She asked for his file. HR, embarrassed by the misreading and wanting to make amends, dug up an old professor evaluation, transcripts, and letters of recommendation that had once mattered in a different chapter of Jack's life. They were neatly stacked in a folder that told a quiet story. He had been a solid, patient, creative teacher who had received glowing mentions for taking students without resources and making them understand. The trick was not that the paper proved anything mystical. It proved that his skills were real and useful and, in the right place, needed. Clara read the letters with something like a new kind of appetite. The irony of a CEO discovering humility in HR files was not lost on her. She realized she had wielded her authority like a tool, when perhaps a conversation would have been more apt. She realized she had let fear decide the motion of her stern reaction instead of curiosity. She stood before the group that afternoon, called an impromptu meeting, and did something that felt as urgent as any memo could. She apologized. "I want to correct an error," she said, when everyone had gathered in the atrium. The cameras someone had brought for the showcase were still waiting on the sidelines, their red lights like tiny patient eyes. "We made a mistake. We judged one of our own by a title and not by the value of his actions. Jack Hale has been helping our program, quietly and kindly. I apologize for the way this was handled." Her speech was not grand. It didn't have fanfare. It had the steady tone of someone trying to unlearn a reflex. She continued, "We also have been inspired by what we saw here today. I want to announce a new initiative, the Second Chances Learning Initiative, to connect educators who find themselves out of their previous roles with opportunities to teach and mentor in our community. We will partner with local organizations to create safe, structured pathways for experienced teachers and professionals to contribute." The applause that followed was tentative at first and then warm. Miss Rowan wept a little at the corner of her eye, folding a handkerchief with practiced fingers. Jack, remaining unsteady, gave a tiny nod and stepped back behind his cart, pretending he was sweeping. He was not interested in the language of ceremonies. He was interested in whether Ethan would be okay. One of the administrators stepped forward and offered Jack the chance to lead a pilot program. "We could use someone with your ability to connect with kids," she said. "Would you consider heading a small cohort?" Jack took time to answer, because this was different from gratitude. It was work reoffered on new terms. It meant a responsibility he would take on while also threading the delicate life he had to keep together at home. "I'll do it if you'll make sure the program protects the kids and supports the teachers," he said, "and if you keep it open to people who need that second chance." Clara agreed. The program was small at first. 2 classes, a handful of kids, a budget that looked like a promise more than a plan. But the first enrollment day had a buzz to it that felt less like a product launch and more like neighbors opening their doors. The weeks after the public apology were quieter at first, then fuller. Parents came to the atrium not to watch a showcase, but to enroll their kids in Jack's hands-on math lab. He taught by using pizza to explain halves and quarters, by making a lesson out of balancing a broom against a mop, by writing a problem on a whiteboard and encouraging mistakes as the critical data of learning. Ethan began to sit at the table more often, finger tracing the fraction circles as kids compared slices, talking in short phrases that grew with each day into longer sentences. He practiced the phrase they had used, at first by itself and then as a scaffold to wider statements. One afternoon, after they had wrapped up a puzzle about shapes, Ethan walked up to a boy who had been teasing a smaller child and said, "Please stop. That's not kind." The words were clumsy and new, but they were his. The boy looked at him in surprise and then apologized. A small, ordinary reconciliation became another stone in the path Jack had been careful to lay. Clara visited the program once a week, sitting in the back, eyes sometimes glinting with the seriousness of someone learning patience. She noticed how Jack's lessons were less about teaching rote facts and more about giving children the sense that they could be wrong and then try again. She began to ask questions about pedagogy and logistics, not as a person eager to systematize compassion, but as someone curious about how structure could hold gentleness in place. She found herself listening in a way she would not have imagined, learning that systems could learn from people as much as people could learn from systems. A year later, the program had a modest expansion. HR had crafted protocols that allowed experienced professionals from other backgrounds to volunteer under vetted conditions, earning one another's trust. Clara announced a small grant for the initiative, framed in the language of corporate social responsibility, but delivered with the personal sincerity of someone who had made a mistake and wanted to do better because of it. The repaired pencil found its way back into Jack's hand one chilly morning, when Ethan, with a full backpack and a small, crooked smile, handed him the small nub that had belonged to a child who had once not spoken. It was a tiny ceremony. No cameras, no speeches, just the passing of a familiar tool from one set of fingers to another. Jack sharpened it carefully and tucked it once again behind his ear. On one of those afternoons that felt like the way things should have been, Clara stopped by unannounced. The atrium was busy with children, and the smell of glue and the sound of laughter. She watched as Jack knelt beside a small girl who had been struggling to assemble a class project, bending his ruined pencil like a wand. He explained a step, and then, when the girl hesitated, he said, with the same small kindness he had used with Ethan months before, "Try saying it like this," and coached her through the instruction. The simplicity of the moment, no agenda, no policy-metered action, moved something in Clara, who had learned in the space of a year that humility could be daily work. She approached him afterward. "You've done good here," she said. Jack shrugged, in the way people do when they want to deflect praise. "It's what I can give," he said. "Just small things, one at a time." Clara smiled, this time less a corporate smile and more a human one. "We couldn't have done this without you." Jack looked at her for a long beat. "We," he repeated, and it felt right. In the end, the greatest change was not the program's certificate or the new memo about volunteers. It was the quiet movement of people in the building who had once crossed lines to avoid risk and now crossed them to offer help. The security guard, Tom, learned the names of certain children and began to bring books to his post. HR redesigned volunteer onboarding with a focus on mentorship rather than suspicion. Parents who had once been wary of strangers in the atrium began to volunteer themselves. The place shifted like a field tilting toward the sun. For Jack, the work was a patchwork of moments. He continued to clean because he found truth in that work. The literal clearing away of what had been trampled allowed space for new growth. He taught because he could see patterns and loved watching them click into place on young faces. He fathered because each night he sang for Ethan, and sometimes, in the pauses, the boy answered with a small fact or a question about something he'd learned, an astronomical curiosity he kept for himself, or a sudden urge to know why the sun set red over the river. Ethan spoke more and more. His sentences came stumbling and sincere. He once told his father, in the quiet after dinner, "Today I helped Thomas see how shapes fit like pieces." And you could have passed a coin along the seam of Jack's jaw, his pride thin as silver. One winter evening, as the atrium lights softened and the last children left with scarves undone and cheeks red with cold, Clara stood by the glass watching Jack and Ethan, father and son, walk across the courtyard. Ethan's hand was in Jack's. The world still packed people into titles, but sometimes it asked someone to decide whether to let them stay there. Clara had decided, and that decision had rippled outward. The repaired pencil lay in Jack's breast pocket, a small signal he wore like an insignia. Tools and talent matter, and compassion can be organized without steamrolling dignity. He still chewed the end of the pencil sometimes when he was thinking, and Ethan still drew houses that sometimes had windows with curtains and sometimes had superheroes painted across the roof. Life stayed messy, the way life had always been, but their noise was different now, fuller, more human. At the end of the day, when the children's chatter had settled, the mop was hung up, and the whiteboards were clean, Jack put his card away and took Ethan by the hand. They walked home along the river, the city lights bleeding into moving water. They stopped at a bench, and Ethan leaned into his father, shoulder to shoulder, in the kind of close that does not need words. "Say it," Jack said, with nothing coaxing about it, more like an invitation. "I am safe," Ethan answered, the words steadying them both. Clara stood across the street for a moment, hands in her pockets, and watched them go. She felt the house in her chest rearrange itself a little. policy now paired with mercy. She had learned, late and sometimes clumsily, that it was possible to be both careful and kind. If this moved you, subscribe for more stories that remind us to see each other. Jack might have scoffed at the idea of being a story. He preferred the quiet doing of things. But the truth was, stories were how people learned to soften the edges of their expectations. He had been given a second chance to teach. His son had been given the space to try his voice again. The community had been invited to look differently at who held worth. They kept teaching, kept saying small phrases that scaffolded the great things people did not yet know they could say. The repaired pencil stayed sharp behind Jack's ear, a quiet emblem of the ordinary work of making a life whole. And once, on a bright morning when the atrium smelled of oranges and paper boats, a child who had been silent stood at a microphone and said, without prompting, "I can try." The room listened. The world learned the shape of what it could become when people looked past titles and into hands that still knew how to do important things.